Good morning, everybody. It is Friday, October 9th. It's about 11:20. I just sent out an email to you a few minutes ago saying that I completely blew it by waking up this morning and for some reason thinking it was Saturday. And the only excuse I have for that is that my days sometimes get a little bit fouled up with all the quarantining and isolating and all that sort of stuff. So I apologize for my error, and I hope you'll forgive me. As I said, I did send out an email a few minutes ago. A couple of you wrote and said, "Dr. Webb, we have class today," and that's when I discovered my error. I logged in at about 10:30 or so to check my email. It's Saturday morning. I'll check my email. Oh man! All right, so I'm wearing another hat today. I had my cowboy hat a few weeks ago. This is my German Bavarian hat. I got this in Munich in 2008. I really like it. It's shrunk a little bit. It used to fit me a little better, but I've always loved these kind of hats. And when I was a kid, there was a TV series, a local TV series on local TV called Polka Parade in Los Angeles. And Polka Parade, as the name suggests, they had these guys who played this upbeat, kind of happy Alpine, Bavarian polka music, mostly. And they dressed, with the leather shorts, and they had the hats like this. I called them polka hats, and they played the trumpets and the trombones, and it was a really cool show because of the hats. So when I was in Munich in 2008, I came upon this incredible hat store, and sure enough, it was they sold, among other things, they sold these kind of hats. So I had to get one, and I tried to find that store the next time I went to Munich about 3 or so years later, and for some reason I couldn't find it. It was a huge store. Maybe they went out of business, but man, I would buy all of their stock in my size, stock of hats. I love this stuff. Anyway, enough of that. So let's get down to brass tacks. I'm going to do a lecture. Let's see if I can keep it to about 25 minutes. Let's hope. And I want to talk about the kind of stuff that I wanted to do this morning. We would have been doing it interactively, but at least this way we'll get through the material so that we won't be particularly far behind. I see something floating around behind me. I wonder if it's a fly or something like that, and you can see it there. So I'm going to pull a Mike Pence. I hope I don't pull a Mike Pence and have a fly land on my head. If you don't know what that reference is, it's the debate the other night with Mr. Pence and Kamala Harris. Okay, look it up on Google. Mike Pence fly. That'll get you what you need to know. And okay, so let's talk a little bit about our material. This reading that was due today touched on some contributions made by great Roman rhetoricians, and the greatest of them all was Cicero, a name you may have heard. Cicero lived a long and I think I'm sure fulfilling life. He was really a public figure, well regarded in his time for his leadership, his political acumen, his oratory, especially his oratory. And he set some standards for what counts as good oratory, good public speaking in the political, especially the political realm, but also the judicial realm, the realm of the courts. And many of his proposals, many of his theories about this have endured through today. Um, or they haven't, or I should say, or they've been violated so often that it's worthwhile to think about them as setting a very high mark, a high bar for what counts as good oratory in the public sphere, in the world of the courts, the political world. Um, we didn't have what we would think of now as the corporate world or the organizational world. We didn't have that precisely in Cicero's day, which was about 100 years or so after the death of Christ. But certainly much of what counts for him as great rhetorical skill um, in the political or the judicial spheres also could apply to the corporate sphere, maybe the academic sphere as well. So let's talk a little bit about Cicero, then I want to talk about another Roman rhetorician and move along a little bit. Okay, so the person's name is Cicero. You'll recognize him from the reading, and he tied together a number of human capacities. He suggested that training and education, in a formal sense, education in the way we would think of education, studying a number of things. Now, the number of subjects one would study in Rome was obviously much fewer than today, but if you had anything like what we might call a formal education in Rome, that would look like studying some mathematics, studying some geometry, maybe even studying some architecture, and studying rhetoric, studying public speaking, studying how to put words together to have an effect on the audience. And that would be sort of the formal kind of piece of training, and then education. And then the training piece would be the praxis, the practical activities that you do to get good at the practical pieces of your education. So specifically training in public speaking, the kind of training that had been initiated and developed in Greece with the sophists. That kind of training carried forth across the Mediterranean and across the centuries into what we think of as classical Rome. So Cicero was the embodiment of just about everything he taught. He was a well respected politician. He was a well respected orator and rhetorician. He was a well respected public figure, a well respected teacher. Everything he did, he was pretty good at, and he had a very good reputation doing. So his ability to appeal to ethos just about always was very high. He knew what he was talking about, both then and now. So he thought that there is a kind of a through line that connects training and education, as I said, wisdom and the willingness to be accountable for your actions, character. In Greece, they would call it being a phronimos, and service as a leader. He thought that well educated, smart, good speakers who knew how to be men of character. This was a world where women were given less attention along these lines. These people had a responsibility to serve the public in the capacity of leader, not necessarily their entire lives, but for a good portion of their adult lives. And so good leadership was tied into all of these things. You couldn't be a good leader without good formal education, good training in public speaking. You couldn't be a good leader unless you had a demonstrated track record of wisdom and accountability. So all of these things tied into one another. You couldn't sort of separate any of them. If you did, you suddenly had someone who was less able, less qualified to be a leader, a public servant, public administrator, and so forth. So Cicero really held people's feet to the fire to be all of these things in order to be one of these things. The one thing being a good, honest, effective leader in the public square. He advocated a vigorous style of delivery as a public speaker, almost theatrical. So he believed that you had to, kind of, if you got it, flaunt it kind of a mentality of, you have to kind of put yourself out there a little bit. If you're going to be a speaker, make sure those gestures are powerful. Make sure you can add vocal variety to your delivery. the way that you learn in Com 101. When your teachers say, hey, add more vocal variety. Well, that's, Cicero was the person who really locked that in as something that a good speaker is going to do. And there was a saying in Rome that a good speaker, a good man speaking well, that was the definition of a good speaker. So notice how that really ties together this concept of quote good man meaning ethical person, phronimos from the Greeks, a good person who speaks well. It wasn't enough just to be a good person and a fair speaker or a mediocre speaker. No, if you really wanted to be a good speaker, you had to be a good man. And if you were a good man, you were by definition a good speaker. Part of what's generating this sort of thinking was you have to realize this was before writing and reading, and certainly before print, well before print. This is before writing and reading truly had made an impact on the Western world, the world of the Mediterranean, and the world that was affected by the world of the Mediterranean area. Reading and writing was still not of any particular primacy in Western or near Western societies. So all of this was tied into your skill in producing sound with your voice. It wasn't until later that writing starts to get into the picture. So another contribution Cicero made was he talked about wit and humor. And he was suggesting that if you are wanting to be amusing, if you want to inject humor into your speaking, that's fine as long as it is of a certain type. So he was advocating wit being the kind of cleverness that comes from wordplay, sophisticated wordplay, amusing figures of speech. He did not advocate mimicry, buffoonery, trying to get a laugh by making funny faces. He did not believe in that. He thought that a good person speaking well, a good man speaking well, a leader, a public figure who is a qualified, skillful orator, doesn't have to rely on that sort of what we might call, cheap tricks to get people to chuckle or to laugh or to feel amused. Instead, you relied on language and its innate power. So what I want you to do now, and we would have done this in discussion, what I want you to do now is think about how much or how little Cicero's principles along these lines do or don't apply in the world we inhabit. And I'll give you my take on this. I think that, and by the way, I'm not saying that everything that Cicero believed was right. I mean, just the very fact that he framed all of what he articulated in terms of men and good men doing good things and good men being good speakers, all of that right there, I think I and the majority of us, I hope the majority of us in the room, will sort of take issue with that. There's no reason that all the things that Cicero attributed to men as their province of activity, nowadays in the 21st century, there's no reason in the world that we can't expand our thinking to include women in the group of people who can do all these great things. And that's not even getting into issues like people who are transgender folks. So the point I'm getting to here is obviously one issue I personally would take, and I hope all of us would take, with Cicero was his framing, his continual framing on men being the demonstrators of these skills. However, the question still stands of what of Cicero's ideas do we see or not see anymore in the public square? And I think we do see some of it, and we don't see much of it, really. The one that comes to mind immediately is the sheer insistence on high quality oratory from the people who serve us in the public square. Um, I remember that many years ago, probably about 2005-ish or so, something like that. I was listening. In those days, I listened to a lot of talk radio. For a variety of reasons, I don't do that too much anymore. But in those days, I was listening quite a lot of it, quite a lot of talk radio. And I remember that a host I heard one morning was talking with a caller about a speech by George Bush, uh, Bush 43. And, Bush was sort of known for not being a particularly powerful, articulate rhetor um, as a public speaker. He would read his manuscript from a teleprompter in a sort of a flat way. He didn't really have much of a way with words if he was not on a script. He'd make gaffes in his pronunciation and in the way he put words together. And again, I think one can say that no matter how one feels or felt about George Bush. That's just an analysis. As a public speaking professor. So in this call, the caller was saying, great speech, blah, blah, blah. The only thing is, Bush isn't really as good a speaker as I wish he were. And the host said, I don't care about that. It doesn't matter to me at all. Everybody says he's not a good speaker, that he mangles his words, and he doesn't read that well when he reads from manuscript. Doesn't matter to me at all. I only care about what he says. That would be so non-Ciceronian. That would be so not okay by the standards that Cicero set, the high bar, the high standards that Cicero set in Rome. And it unsettled and upset me personally only because I do place a great deal of importance on the ability to speak well, to be competent as an orator. If you're going to be in a position of public responsibility, there is a great deal of motive power in the spoken word. And to be indifferent towards skill in delivering the spoken word, I think you're giving a public figure a great deal of leeway. You're giving that person a huge pass. And we also see this today. We see President Trump, when he's on his own, when he's standing behind a lectern and talking in an improvisational manner, an impromptu manner at a rally where he's feeling the love from the audience, when sort of everything's going his way, he believes with the moment he's got people to in his previous comments earlier in the rally. He's pretty comfortable and he's competent as a speaker, to say the least. I mean, he's got people cheering and all that stuff. But you get him in front of a teleprompter or a written script, and his delivery is, to me, unforgivably poor. He rushes through it in a flat voice with no vocal variety. He stumbles over words he oughtn't to stumble through because he probably hasn't rehearsed. He probably hasn't taken the time to figure out how to pronounce some of the words that may be difficult to pronounce. And again, it doesn't matter what I think about Trump if I love him or hate him. That's irrelevant. I'm looking at this purely from an analytical point of view as someone who knows something about public speaking. It's my profession. And he's not a good, what's called manuscript speaker, meaning someone who is operating out of a printed text. And I mentioned teleprompters a couple of times. Teleprompter speaking, for some reason, has acquired this image or reputation of being bad in some way. I remember back in 2007, 2008, 2009, when President Obama was running for office, was elected, was giving speeches, and finally was elected and was giving speeches as the new president. The rap on him by his detractors was, oh, he's not good with that. If he doesn't have it on a teleprompter, he can't give a speech. Well, the flip side of that is, how good or bad is the speaker when using a teleprompter? There's nothing inherently wrong with a teleprompter. A teleprompter is simply what is called historically a, quote, manuscript speech. A manuscript speech means a speech that you deliver not from memory. You deliver it not because you have rehearsed it so many times that the basic message is installed within you, and you can just start talking and know and trust that that basic message is going to come out, not in a memorized form or fashion, but just in the words that you're choosing in the moment, because you've practiced the message so much, it's part of you. That's called extemporaneous speaking. But a manuscript speech is a mode of delivery that is woefully undervalued in today's world. So many speeches are manuscript, and yet so many of them are delivered kind of the way that President Trump delivers them, which is to say, flat, uninspiring. And the fact that you've got wonderful words in a speech, the fact that someone wrote a speech for you to deliver, or the fact that you wrote a speech yourself that may be at the level of language, articulate, clever, profound, whatever, and you deliver it in a manner that really, in a public speaking class, would get you at best a C- on the assignment, I think there's no excuse for that. I feel offended. I feel insulted when public figures take oratory that unseriously. And if President Obama happened to be effective in delivering manuscript speeches from either the printed page or a teleprompter, if he happened to have been good at that, well, fair enough. That in itself is a good thing. The fact that it was on a teleprompter or the fact that it was on a printed page is essentially irrelevant, in the sense that it doesn't matter where you're getting the words from. It doesn't matter how you're handling the canon of memory. Is it memory because you've memorized it? Are you handling the canon of memory because you've rehearsed it so much that you're using different words each time you give the speech, but you're always giving the same message? Or is memory aids, like a manuscript or notes? How is the canon of memory handled and managed in league with the way in which you're expressing yourself? That's what matters. So, Cicero would say what I was just saying. He would say, it doesn't matter how you carry the information in your mind or on a page or in a teleprompter screen. What matters is, how do you utter the words? How do you gesture? How do you deliver when you're putting the words from memory, moving the words from memory to spoken language? And as I said, I have a very strong bias in this regard. You are more than welcome to disagree with me, but I think it's a horrific loss of a requirement that we have long held as a species, that leadership, people in visible roles of responsibility, accountability, the demand that they also be very articulate and able to deliver nuanced ideas, that demand has fallen by the wayside over the years, I think, and I think it's very unfortunate. I could go on about this, and I probably already have. The piece about wit and humor in public speaking. There have been a few major public figures in the last, let's say, 100 years, or let's just say 75 years, just to pick a number out, who have been famous for the subtlety, the nuance, the suppleness of their wit. I remember that for a long time there were books you could see on the shelves, The Wit and Wisdom of. And often the person it was wit and wisdom of were, in the day, current or former candidates for office. So the two that stand out is for years you could see books called The Wit and Wisdom of John F. Kennedy, a man who is considered to be, on one hand, um, a skillful writer, and he could express himself in writing very, very well. He'd written books. He'd had a newspaper column before he became really famous as a politician. But also, he was known as a very good orator, and he was very witty. He could say some very amusing things that weren't buffoonery, they weren't mimicry. And I'm not trying to, romanticize the memory of a quote martyred president. I'm just saying that if you go back and you really look with uh, neutral or objective views, the qualities that Kennedy brought to the moment of encountering the public and speaking with the public, you are looking at someone who was pretty effective as a public speaker. Maybe not absolutely the best ever, but very effective, more effective than many of our speakers today. And he had a wit that we do not normally see. Maybe we as a public have lost our capacity to appreciate subtlety and humor. But his most famous quip is one of my most favorite political quips. And he once said, now you have to know, to appreciate this, you have to know that Thomas Jefferson, famous Thomas Jefferson, very controversial now because he was a slave owner. And on the other hand, he also was a smart man, a self-taught architect, a self-taught amateur scientist. I mean, this was a very interesting and complex guy, Jefferson, and known to be very smart, very well read. Um, you have to know that to appreciate the quip. But anyway, so in 1962 or thereabouts, President Kennedy held a dinner at the White House um, for the Nobel Prize winners from the United States. And there were many of them, and former laureates, current winners, etc. They had a huge dinner at the White House. So Kennedy stood up at a certain point to address them, and he said, "It's an honor to be speaking with you tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you for a few minutes." He said, "This is probably the most astonishing um, uh, presence of internationally remarkable brain power to be in the White House ever, with the possible exception of the evenings when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." Now, you may not think that's really, really funny. I'm not trying to sell you on how funny that is, but it's clever, it's witty. And I don't think we see too much of that sort of wit. Maybe we're not sophisticated enough to appreciate that sort of thing. I don't know. But I mean, I just cannot see that being said by really any contemporary public figure that comes to mind instantly. And, again, using President Trump as a good example here, if we're talking about a good man speaking well, a good man or woman who is a public speaker, who is a good orator and speaks well, and in part avoids buffoonery and mimicry, that certainly doesn't describe President Trump, whose stock in trade as a speaker often is mimicry, buffoonery, getting really what we might call cheap laughs. And again, it doesn't matter if I love Trump or hate Trump. That's irrelevant. This is an analysis as a public speaking professional, if you will. And so it's very difficult, I think, to see all of these qualities that Cicero articulated way back when. And I think it's worthwhile, however, to hold them up as a standard of performance that we call upon our public figures to at least intentionally try to approach. So this isn't even getting into how any of this applies to roles that simply did not exist back in Cicero's days. And I'm thinking of media professionals, media commentators, YouTube influencers. How might any of this apply to a vlogger who makes a new post 3 times a week, 5 times a week, and looks into the camera and talks about things? How would Ciceronian ideals guide that? All right, so that's something to think about. Second thing I wanted to bring up is Longinus, and he's got the creepiest name of all of the rhetoricians from ancient days. It's just every time I even say it, I always feel a little bit creeped out just because it sounds like I'm talking about who knows what. It's like some kind of a disease, I don't know what, but Longinus. And it's am I making a joke about something? But that's the way you pronounce it, best as I know. Longinus, Longinus. And his great contribution that bears noting is he tied all of this into the realm of writing because he came along a couple of centuries after Cicero. Writing had started to emerge. It was emerging enough that Longinus essentially said, geez, I wonder if we could apply this to the written word, all this stuff about the spoken word. I wonder if that kind of applies. And the answer he came up with was, yes, it does. And it's worth it to talk about some of what he said about rhetoric in the context of the written word. So his first major contribution we need to talk about is he articulated this concept of the sublime. And he said that writing is the province of the sublime. In other words, we can really achieve the sublime in writing because one of the great potential areas of greatness of writing, one of the potential characteristics that makes writing a great or distinctive modality is you can change it pretty easily. I mean, if I'm giving a speech, once I say something, it's said. And if I want to go back and say, well, what I really mean is such and such, I can. But you can't unhear what you heard as an audience member. Well, in writing, I can make all sorts of, upgrades, alterations, edits, adjustments, deletions, replacements. I can do all that before anybody sees what I've written so I can get a polished final draft, a polished manuscript, and make all the mistakes I want to, and no one will ever know. So Longinus said, given that, there is no reason that a writer cannot use emotions and generate emotions by choosing just the right words to express lofty ideas rather than flat, bland ideas. What a waste of what was in those days very expensive writing materials. I mean, we think of paper as something that's just easily found. In those days, if you wrote on something, it was very expensive to produce that sheet on which you wrote. So Longinus basically was thinking, let's not waste it. Anytime something goes on to a sheet, onto a medium, it had better be lofty, it had better be powerful, it had better be emotionally compelling and sublime. Great ideas plus lofty language equals sublime. So Longinus fought for that in the sense that he really promoted this idea. And he said that great language for the written word came from 5 sources, and one of it was just great ideas, really thinking very deeply about the ideas you wanted to express. He would back up, he would buy into Cicero's concepts of a trained, well-educated speaker, trained, well-educated writer, someone who really thought deeply. Number 2, second source, Longinus talked about inspired emotion. So Longinus talked about really going deep into thinking about what's the emotion I want to generate in my writing, what's the emotion I'm feeling when I think about this stuff. Number 3, he talked about what he called noble diction, which basically means the way you express yourself is elevated. We've talked about high, middle, and low style. Longinus would emphasize the importance of what we would call high or maybe middle style. He thought that noble diction, noble ways of expressing yourself, were vital to favor. He would not, think that low style was worthy of becoming part of the written word. And his beliefs about the importance of lofty style being associated with writing, those have held all these years. Think about the Declaration of Independence, for example. Now, that is just really lofty style, it's sort of difficult to penetrate at times. Think about how, like, the worst undergraduate writing tries to mimic what an undergraduate thinks is, quote, good academic writing. And it's usually really roundabout. We talk about this in Com 105. And how what I'm wanting to teach you in writing is how to go for a lower style. So I'm kind of departing from Longinus when I talk about that. And the world is expecting you to depart from solely lofty language. Now, you can play with that a little bit with figures. We'll talk about that in a second. But just think about how lofty language may not be the only way to think about the best language for writing. The next fourth source kind of ties into that. It's the choice of word and specifically the choice of figures. Longinus talked a great deal about really putting together figures of speech that pop, that work, yet without calling a great deal of attention to themselves. And then finally, dignified, he called it dignified arrangement, which we would think of as syntax, the assembling of words and phrases together in a sentence so that the sentence flows. It's not choppy, it's not difficult to navigate it. Dignified syntax. And Longinus, as I said, really liked figures. He really promoted the use of figures of speech. But he put a break on that a little bit. He said, if it's too clever, or there's too many really clever figures of speech in one piece of writing, it's going to arouse the reader's suspicion. They're going to think you're trying to put something over on them. So think about how that ties into the current way we talk about marketing materials. If you are too clever with the way you express the good news about your product or service, you start to have people sort of suspect this is just another advertising ploy. And maybe that's one reason why we hear so many repeated words and phrases and figures in the world of advertising, marketing, communication. Solutions, not problems. This isn't a problem, it's an opportunity. We sort of don't stray from what works and what we've kind of thought is, on the one hand, somewhat clever, but not so clever that it arouses suspicion. Of course, when something is used that often and that it becomes a cliche, that arouses suspicion. So these are some very delicate spaces to try to inhabit as a writer who's concentrating on effective writing. Okay, it's almost time for my 12 o'clock class. We've gone on for under 40 minutes. That's good. That is not any more than that's certainly not a long class session. So I'm going to call it quits there. This is our lecture that's making up for not having class today. We'll see you on Monday, the 12th, at our usual time at 9 o'clock.